There's nothing quite like a classic car, but original replacement parts are often very hard to come by. Fortunately, there's a whole industry dedicated to replicating classic car parts that look just like the originals. After all, modern digital instruments just wouldn't look right in the dashboard of a classic car. The internal parts of these car gauges are new, but they have the same old faces. The old-style dials are built to the original designs as replacement parts for classic and vintage vehicles. Making a classic car gauge starts with a zinc-coated steel blank. A blank is placed on a tool, and a press stretches it around the form to shape it into the gauge case. After a flange has been formed on the rim and holes punched for assembly purposes, it's on to the next operation. Another engineer welds a stud to the back of the case. The stud will be used to mount the gauge to the dashboard. Another team member paints the inside of the case white. Next, a brass tube for the light bulb is secured in its fixture, and a case is placed over it. A press crimps the top of the light tube around one of the holes in the case, securing the tube to the back. A mechanized printer pad picks up ink from the engravings on a metal plate and transfers them to a dial. For this gauge, they'll need a hollow curved spring known as a bourdon tube. To shape this flat brass tube into a spring, one end is tucked into a forming tool. A shim is inserted into the other end to keep the tube hollow as it's curled around the form. This turns the flat tube into a C-shaped spring. Then one end is crimped in a press. The crimped end is dipped into a chemical cleaning agent and then into hot solder. The solder hardens and seals this end of the bourdon spring. A brass adapter is soldered to the open end of the bourdon tube. This hollow socket is the part that will receive fluid under pressure. It's that pressure that will cause the tube to unwind and move gears that turn the needle on the gauge dial. The tube is then placed in water and pressurized air is pumped into it through the socket. The tube is checked for bubbles that would indicate there's a leak. They make the gears that move the needle using a hobbing machine. It's a spinning cutter that carves teeth into brass parts known as racks. Another team member inserts a brass pivot in a holding device. Using a press, she crimps the pivot to the center of the rack. Then she assembles a hairspring and pinion between two brass plates and positions the rack in the gear sandwich. The assembly is secured using a hand press. Now with tweezers, she pulls the end of the spring through a hole in one of the posts and locks it in place with a pin. She turns the shaft to confirm that the rack and pinion gears engage and work smoothly. Returning to the bourdon tubes, she transfers one to a fixture and locks it in place. The gears are placed on top of the tube and screwed to the side of the socket. She then installs the bourdon tube assembly in the fuel gauge casing. Next, the gauge is connected to a pressurized air source. The retro dial is put into the device, and the needle is attached to the protruding gear shaft. Then air is introduced at a known pressure to calibrate the gauge. A gasket is tucked into the top rim, and then fitted with a glass pane on top. A chrome-plated bezel retains the assembly and frames it. And a press finally snaps the components together. Made to measure, this car gauge is now complete, and it looks like a classic. except we're running on empty.